So I will start by giving the floor to Alex.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk here tonight. I know there has been a certain amount of negative discussion in the media here about this meeting, about the involvement of Christian Aid and others. I want to be very clear on something to begin with. This meeting is not in any way focused on attacking Jersey. This meeting is about the systemic financial issues that face particularly developing countries, but also the wider world through the crisis and through the facilitation of tax avoidance and tax evasion. I want to say something first about Jersey itself. From Christian Aid's point of view, Jersey is extremely generous. You know, we receive something of the order of £300,000 a year to support the work that we do with the poorest people in the world, including in Ethiopia in particular, and a number of other countries that Jersey has identified that it wants to support. But there is an inconsistency, and that's really what our concern is, that the lack of transparency in the global financial system not only contributed to the underpinning causes of the crisis that we're all now suffering, but it also is responsible for draining away tax revenues that developing countries desperately need to provide basic services, health and education, and a minimum level of social security to their people. Now, Christian Aid has estimated that the tax losses in developing countries due to the mispricing of trade, much of which goes through tax havens, or secrecy jurisdictions, as we'd rather call them, is of the order of $160 billion every year. Now that's more than 1.5 times the global total of aid. So even in terms of the revenue impact alone, this is of huge importance to development. But tax is also important for development in a number of other ways. It's the mechanism by which states are able to redistribute from the richest to the poorest, if they have effective taxation systems. It's also the fundament of the relationship between states and their citizens. Without effective taxation, you do not have effective political representation. So one of the benefits of supporting effective taxation in developing countries is that you see a strengthening of governance, undermining of the opacity that encourages corruption, and a growth in the extent to which governments respond to their people's needs, rather than simply spending money according to their own preferences. Just to take one example of what those lost revenues could do, if that $160 billion a year was spent according to current spending patterns, so with no improvement to reflect the improvement in governance that we think we'd see, in just picking out one example of what would happen from that, we estimate that something around 1,000 children under 5 every day would no longer die in developing countries. Now, the technical work behind that result is set out in a report we published in May last year called Death and Taxes, the two certainties of the world, although perhaps not taxes for everyone. That report's available on our website, along with another called The Morning After the Night Before, which looks at the role of secrecy jurisdictions in contributing to the financial crisis. Now, I think probably most of you are aware to some extent of the impact that the crisis is already having in developing countries, so I won't say too much about that. But what we're seeing is a collapse in development finance, a collapse in the trade and the exports that developing countries can make to richer countries, increasing pressure on the aid commitments of rich countries, a collapse in the remittances that expatriates are sending back to their families in developing countries, and a collapse in the commodity prices that a lot of countries have relied on the natural resource wealth to fund, in the absence of effective taxation, to fund their states. But there's a silver lining, and that silver lining is that the crisis has opened up the political space at the G20 for effective measures to increase the transparency in global financial markets, which would have impacts not only in terms of making the next crisis less likely, but also, and most importantly, in terms of opening up some space for developing countries to have more effective taxation systems. Now, I just want to finish by saying something about the impact of what that process at the G20 is having, is likely to be on Jersey. If there is no attempt to go along to find the functioning sections of the financial system here that do not rely on opacity, and in many ways parts of Jersey's financial system are well regulated, some say more well regulated than the City of London, for example, then Jersey risks being seriously damaged by this process. On the other hand, what we as Christian Aid are pushing for, and I think the states of Jersey would agree with this, is a level playing field. The approach the G20 takes cannot be based on simply a blacklist of the first names people think of in terms of tax havens. It has to apply across the board, whether that's to Singapore, to the City of London, to Delaware in the United States. And in that way, not only will this deliver justice for the jurisdictions that are being affected, it will also be effective for developing countries. Finally, those measures at the G20 must also recognise the impact that they're likely to have on the citizens of the jurisdictions affected, to provide them with support during that process and to investigate alternative paths for economic development that don't rely on the old model that is broken and that won't be allowed to continue. So I hope there's a possibility for a constructive dialogue between organisations like Christian Aid focused on development and the states of Jersey and others. Thank you.